American economy grew at its fastest pace in nearly 4 years in the second quarter. The GDP increased at a 4.1% annualized rate, the strongest data since the third quarter of 2014. Will the positive data give Trump more confidence to carry on a trade war? However, according to the U.S. Commerce Department's advanced estimate of June figures, a widening gap in the country's trade deficit is showing a 5.5% deficit, with exports falling 1.5% and imports rising 0.6%. What effect will these changes have on Trump's thinking? Meanwhile, Trump is fighting trade battles on multiple fronts. One with Europe appears to be on hold after a visit from the European Commission's president last week, and another with China. Trump is threatening to ramp up duties on $500 billion worth of Chinese goods, almost all of China's exports to the U.S. How far apart are the two sides from being able to sit down and talk again? And how is the timing of the trade battles likely to coincide with the U.S. political process? With the midterm elections coming, Trump is preparing for his banners, which are being made in eastern China. The U.S. Department of Commerce said flags and other textile products made in China would be subject to a 10% levy under the current strategy. That would double the price of a Make America Great Again hat. Will Trump's banners be hit by his own punitive tariff plans?
Buy American and hire American.
Making America great again, or making America more expensive? If Trump's midterm election rallies have no flags to fly, there's only one man to blame.
The recent decades' reform and opening up of China created a dramatic change for this nation and its people, and it appears another defining moment may have been reached as a potential trade war looms and the fate of globalization hangs in the balance. What are the choices involved in the path ahead? How will China move ahead in what could be a historic turning point? And how will the fate of future generations be shaped by what is decided now? To discuss these issues and more, today I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Da Wei, Assistant President of the University of International Relations, and Edward Wittenstein, Executive Director of the Johnson Center for the Study of American Diplomacy at Yale University. That's our topic. This is the Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue. It is reported that the President Trump is planning 25% tariffs increase on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, much higher than the 10% expected. Now that makes headlines, of course, around the world. It shows no sign of limiting the size of the massive trade war that's going to break out, or to a large degree has already broken out. What will China's next move be, in your estimation?
I think of course, China have to take some retaliative measures against this tariff. But of course, I don't think it will be a symmetric retaliation because, as you said, 200 billion tariff, this is very high, and actually it's more than the amount that China import from the U.S. So China have no 200 billion U.S. good to impose tariff. But China, of course, I think China will also add tariffs on some import goods from the U.S. and China may have some other measures to take, for instance, to help China's company and the factory which is harmed by this tariff, and also China may, maybe in the future negotiation with the U.S., we may give the money to the people and to the factory that being harmed by this, and also we will. I think very important thing is to expand China's reform by ourselves. So we should not follow the steps and the pace of the U.S. side. If they want to do that, and we will retaliate as we can, and then we will push the reform and opening up measures that we want, and as we planned, and then waiting for the moment that we can talk and negotiate with the U.S. side.
What do you think these measures, are they likely to bring the United States back to the negotiating table?
I don't believe so. I think we're at a very precarious moment in U.S.-China relations. It's something that I'm concerned about, and I think the rhetoric coming out of the United States about the trade war really risks alienating a number of people in the United States as well as in China, and feeding into perceptions about the worst fear between one and the other. The U.S. and China have an incredibly complex, dynamic relationship. Like all relationships of that scale, it's a mix of healthy competition, also unhealthy competition. The risk, of course, is that unhealthy competition can become conflict. And I think we're at a moment here where I hope cooler heads will prevail. As mentioned by Professor Da Wei, China has a great deal of flexibility and strategic patience in responding to this United States action. And I'm hopeful that within the United States there remains a great deal of concern within the U.S. Congress among other elements of the American population. So there may be a tapering off in pressure against the President's actions over a period of time. But I do think we're in a difficult period. I think it might get a little bit worse before it gets better, given the domestic politics in the United States. So we're in a period now, I think, of uncertainty. And I think the challenge is, can the reasonable, responsible stakeholders on both sides work together and forge common solutions?
It's a matter of whether both sides are able to take measured steps. Now, the Trump administration has delivered an impressive economic performance in the second quarter with a 4.1% GDP growth. Will that give him more confidence to carry on the trade war?
I suspect likely yes. I'm not an economist myself. As a practitioner of international relations and diplomacy, I tend to look at these issues in terms of geopolitics, in terms of domestic politics in the United States. I do think the President feels strengthened by those numbers. If you look at his rhetoric, I think he views those numbers as justifying of the policies that he's pursued. Many economists will point to other reasons that have resulted in this period of growth.
What is President Trump's approval rating among the Republicans?
It's very high. I haven't seen the latest
Up to 80%?
data. Yeah, it's over 75%, 80%, 90% I've seen in certain polls. So the economic data is promising in many respects, and I think this is part of the challenge for U.S.-China relations. The economic data seems strong, but the relations between U.S. and China are at a very challenging period. So can we pull these two apart, I think, is part of the challenge.
Well, everybody is talking about the midterm elections. What about long-term relationship? You delivered a report a few months back that has impressed many Chinese policymakers and scholars in the circle of international studies with a very pessimistic forecast about this most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. Can you brief us on the long-term impact upon the relationship?
Yes, I think we are witnessing the most difficult period maybe in past 4 decades. The U.S.-China relations is undergoing a very profound change. I mean, in the past 4 decades, the U.S. engaged China and want to bring China into the international system that it led and want to shape China's future. But now China is in the system. Well, the U.S. found that China is not moving in the direction that the U.S. want China to move. So the U.S. is changing its policy. Some people say this is containment. Some people say this is competition. I think maybe competition is a proper word to use to describe the current U.S. administration's policy or strategy towards China. So we will enter a period, I don't know how long it will be, maybe 1 decade, maybe 2 decades, a period of competition of the two countries. I think, of course, competition is not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily a bad word. But the question we are going to ask is what kind of competition we are going to have, I mean, between the two countries. And also what kind of cost do we want to pay for this competition? And also, where is the boundary of this competition? Do we have a code of conduct in this competition. I think this is the question that we need to answer in next decade. I mean, for both U.S. and China, we need a code of conduct. We need a roadmap to control the extent and control the nature of this competition.
First of all, we need to have a declaration of the conduct on both sides in a constructive way. Yes. In the Cold War, Edward, authorities in the Soviet Union have also introduced a kind of a parallel competition between the two superpowers.
Yes.
And the authorities of the Soviet government were very, very confident. I'm not drawing a parallel comparison between the former Soviet Union and the PRC at this moment. But I've heard some noise here in my country about something similar happening between the two countries. Now, of course, that competition, if it could be called a competition, resulted in the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the disintegration of this, what the Reagan administration called evil empire.
Yes.
So everybody is talking about the prospects of this relationship in a very sentimental way. I'd like to have a reasonable voice, okay?
Well, I'll try to be as reasonable as I can. There always are dangers in drawing these sorts of historical parallels and comparisons. But in this way, I think to talk about the U.S.-China relationship as similar to the U.S.-Soviet relationship.
Is that ridiculous?
I think some people do see it that way, which is part of the challenge. It's more mixed than that. I tend to think it's not a good parallel, and that containment or the strategies used to counter Soviet aggression by the United States do not apply to China. And many scholars and people who focus on U.S.-China relations would say that containment is not the policy of the United States. But similarly, there are people who do think that, and I think this is part of the challenge. If you look at some of the rhetoric that has come out of the Trump administration, some of the official documents they've put out on national security strategy, there is this sense of competition, not necessarily in a healthy way, but in this geostrategic competition that I think risks being perceived in the context of containment. So the perception can become reality if the United States and China are both not careful in the rhetoric that they're using. The Soviet parallel, I think, doesn't work in this context because even though this sort of containment policy ultimately resulted, of course, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a significant period of highly aggressive and dangerous confrontation. It ended up okay, and we can say that in hindsight, but there were so many close calls. If you look at the hot conflicts that we saw across the so-called Third World, as well as if you look at near misses between the United States and the Soviet Union over the question of Berlin or in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'm hopeful that we won't be headed in that direction in U.S.-China relations and that cooler heads will prevail. But it does require strategic patience, not buying into the inflammatory rhetoric that some people espouse and trying to make the most of making this relationship more constructive and not less.
Some professionals of international studies with a sober mind pointed out that this most consequential relationship is very much like a 360-degree circle. What has been achieved at this moment on both sides across the Pacific Ocean is only half, is 180 degrees, with the other half being a way of thinking, I mean, how to deal with each other. The United States in particular has established the consensus sort of between the two parties, the bipartisan consensus that China is, of course, a most serious strategic competitor above Russia and even ISIL, according to their landmark documents in recent months. So what do you think should be the most likely response from the Chinese side? We were talking about trade war, but what about the strategy itself? Some of the Chinese pointed out no strategic mistakes should be made on our side. Now, this year witnesses the 40th anniversary of our opening up and reform. Deng Xiaoping said a lot of nice things about the relationship, keeping a low profile, so on and so forth. So what do you think of the most legitimate and reasonable measures we would take?
I think for China, as you said, this is the 40th anniversary of the opening up and the reform. So at this moment, the most important thing for us is not to make strategic misjudgment. I mean, how to judge the external environment, strategic environment. Is this external environment so negative that it will not allow China to develop, to rise peacefully? Is that true or not? I think our external environment is still benign enough to let China to grow, to develop, and to rise in the future. But because this pressure we are feeling from the U.S. and from the Western country, it's very easy for us to think that the external environment is very negative. And also, the market-oriented reform is wrong. And we need to take some, we need to go back to the old path. We need to strengthen to use the nationalistic strength to resist the external pressure. If so, I think this will be a misjudgment on the China side. So I think we need to stick to the old opening up and reform policy, and we are going to, integrate into the system further, try to reform China further. Although the U.S. pressed China so hard, we still need to integrate into it and to make China's economy a market-oriented economy. I think this is very important.
But I'm afraid most players of the international society seem to have taken side with China on the issue of globalization, because President Xi Jinping made it very clear over and over that China will not only be part of the globalization, but will try to assume some kind of leadership in shaping further globalization. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Da Wei and Mr. Edward Wittgenstein. We're discussing U.S.-China relationship. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Edward, everybody's talking about this relationship between the two biggest economies. It seems what the United States is doing, particularly the Trump administration, is trying to correct the way of China's development internally. The industrial policies, for example, regarding 2025 vision, and externally, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So internally and externally, the United States tries very hard to bring China back to what it wants. But from the Chinese perspective, these are absolutely non-negotiable. And therefore, do you think the Trump administration runs the risk of putting the two countries on a head-on collision, in a head-on collision course, and there will be very serious prospects?
The risk is certainly there. The risk of miscalculation, of miscommunication, of escalation due to overreaction to inflammatory rhetoric, these are there, and they have to be acknowledged and confronted and talked about. I think the challenge is that the U.S.-China relationship is so large and so diverse and so complex that it is not a zero-sum game. And this is what worries me about the rhetoric of the trade war in particular, that there's somehow an imbalance on one end that creates a negative on the other. And the nature of our global economy doesn't work that way. And the challenge of leadership is to communicate to both domestic audiences.
Edward, we see the interdependence of the two economies and our two countries with the rest of the world. Now, my question is, will there be a new Cold War descending on East Asia? Because the trade war itself, many argue, will just be the tip of the iceberg. Trade war is nothing. Some even go as far as to say the trade war is nothing. What is worse and disastrous is probably, the two countries going to war on issue of Taiwan or South China Sea.
Yes. I think the possibility of the new Cold War cannot be excluded. I think it's possible. I think there are at least 3 points. One is hot war, like British and the German before the World War I. Second is the Soviet Union and the U.S. Cold War. This is the second point. I don't think our bilateral relations will deteriorate to that extent. But what I worry is a new Cold War. that the status that we are witnessing between the U.S. and Russia today. I think we are, getting close to that tipping point. So China and the U.S. becomes kind of strategic rivalry. Maybe not enemy, but rivalry. And we try to compete each other and beat each other in this competition. Even if I need to, for instance, China and the U.S. need to pay some cost, so long as I can beat it, I can suppress China's development. So I'd rather to tolerate, to accept the price of the trade war. I think this is the mindset of some American leaders like Peter Navarro. They look at this kind of competition from a very nationalistic way. I think this is something that we need to avoid.
The point is whether Peter Navarro represents majority views about China.
I would say no. I think it is a minority view. It is one, though, that President Trump and some of his closest aides have latched onto, and it is tapping into a sense of domestic concern among certain areas of the United States regarding the perceptions of China's rise and the economic impact that may have. So I think part of the challenge is the rhetoric and the policy may be extreme, but it is speaking to concerns, latent concerns, deep-seated concerns that certain segments of the American population do have. And this is why transparency and interaction, I think, is so important in the U.S.-China relationship. And of course, there are areas of Chinese policies that make the United States concerned, and there are ways to talk about the investment climate for businesses in China, concerns over intellectual property, can there be a bilateral investment treaty to address some of these issues, the geopolitical competition that you mentioned. All of these are real, right? So it's not just to discount them, but rather to say that we need to talk about them in a transparent way that can foster at least a mutual understanding, even if the competition is, in fact, to still occur.
That way, when you give us your analysis about the three kind of situations, we'd like to know more about conditions attached to the three scenarios. For example, President Trump is staging a war against almost every economy, major economies, in particular Europeans, the two neighboring countries of Canada, Mexico. India is no exception. So everybody's angry and feels quite upset about what President Trump really wants, who is known for his unpredictability and ego-driven policies in a way. So the issue is whether we go to war or we are on a collision course. It depends on the coalition or partnership, if not alliance, with our friends and partners. On our side, we prefer not to have any wartime alliance or military mutual defense treaties with our very good friends. The United States, however, still maintains the Cold War legacy of military alliance in not only Northeast Asia, although commitments towards the NATO may be undermined somehow because of President Trump's demand for fair share of the defense budget from European partners. So what do you think of this aspect of our concerns, partnership or military alliance? Because this has a lot to do with whether we're going to go to war.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I don't think China and the U.S. is going to enter a war. I think that is highly unlikely, no matter...
Because we're nuclear armed?
Yes, I think we are both nuclear power. This is a very simple fact that prevents China and the U.S. from either a nuclear war or conventional war. And also, I don't think we are going to enter a Cold War because, though troublesome, we still have very strong economic ties and also people-to-people ties. This is totally different from the U.S. and the USSR during the Cold War. So what we need to prevent is, prevent the U.S. and China bilateral relations deteriorate into new Cold War. New Cold War. This is Russia and the U.S. And here, I think the partnership, we need to assess the partnership and alliance very accurately, because you mentioned this. I think, particularly on the economic issue, I think it's a little bit simplified to say that there is a united front all over the world, against Trump administration's trade war. I think we need to look at it more carefully. I mean, yes, it's true that, for instance, EU and Mexico and Canada, they all oppose trade war. They also oppose the U.S. Unilateral imposing the tariff against China. But I have to say, Japan and the EU share the similar concern over China's economic model and also China's economic policy. So on that regard, I think they are partner. So there is a very nuanced, the difference here. They oppose Trump's policy, but they share the U.S. concern. I think here, very complicated.
And they also share the same value
yes.
Across the Atlantic Ocean. The last point I want to raise before we conclude this very interesting discussion with you guys is, before you initiate a crusade against the other side, the adversaries, you need to demonize them one way or another, like Senator McCarthy during the Cold War. Today, China is accused of, undertaking cyber espionage, stealth, so on and so forth. That's a very ugly picture. And people like Peter Navarro has never come to China. And yet he's the strongest voice about this bad image of China. So do you think this is just propaganda on your side?
Well, it'd be great to have Peter on your show to tell you his own views on these issues. I will just speak to the cyber issue in particular because it is one that I do work on and teach on at Yale University. This is an area of concern between U.S.-China relations, theft of intellectual property through cyber means. But it's one that the U.S. and China have actually made great strides towards addressing together, in particular in the last few years, coming out of the Sunnylands Summit with President Xi Jinping and President Obama, and the commitment on both sides not to sort of knowingly support this cyber theft of intellectual property from 2015 onward. That concern has somewhat diminished since that time. It does, I think, show that the United States and China can work constructively on issues. There are obviously continued concerns about this area, and I agree. My concern is that if we make this issue, or any of the issues in the U.S.-China relationship, a demonized issue, that it will obscure the underlying challenge. Cybersecurity is a very complicated law, technology, policy problem of which the United States and China approach from very different historical perspectives. And again, it's one of these issues, one of many issues in the U.S.-China relationship that need to be worked on by thoughtful technical experts to resolve, or at least work towards a common understanding. And so when you have that rhetoric about horrible activities on both sides, this is both coming out of the Trump administration, it's coming out of some of the more extreme elements of the Chinese government and the military. I do think lack of transparency is what fuels a lack of trust, and so the challenge is, can there be constructive dialogue? Not some wonderful agreement where the United States and China become automatic friends. I don't think anyone would say that's a realistic possibility, but can we reach a point where we understand each other's perspectives?
Thank you so much. Well, trust deficit is, of course, a most serious concern for both sides. Talking tough in the standoff between the two, because economies and militaries won't be good for the Pacific region, which I'm afraid and hopefully will be big enough to accommodate the strategic needs of both countries. Whether China will have a peaceful development largely depends on the bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing. I'll see you next time.